Previously on the Downscaling Chronicles.
After some time using the Dexx add-on for the DE10 Nano, the development board used for the Mr. FPGA, the symbiotic hardware felt like the 32X of downscaling. It was an impressive, yet imperfect stopgap, with prerequisites that posed as barriers to entry. You lose! And no proper 1080p input. And now that the stranglehold of the part shortage is hopefully a thing of the past, the successor to the Dexx and open source scan converter is here. Thanks to the ingenuity of Marqs, this is the OSSC Pro. Admittedly, at the end of the downscaler wars, I was dismissive of the eventual OSSC Pro, stating this: if the same line discarding method is ported over to the OSSC Pro, apart from maybe 1080p inputs, then probably nothing new. And how wrong I was. Because this immediately feels like a premium and polished product, sporting a VGA input that accepts all flavors of RGB and component, separate component RCAs for YPbPr and Sync-on Green RGB, and most noteworthy, an input for HDMI. I'm on the most current firmware as of April 2024, and my all-inclusive OSSC Pro, power supply and remote bundle was purchased through Video Game Perfection, which cost me €310 excluding shipping. You'd be fine without the remote thanks to the front pivot button, but for the extra €13, it's hard to go without. Probably an overlooked and definitely welcomed feature is a standby mode, so it's friendly to use with an auto switcher like the Scart. There's also a provision to add a cooling fan in case it's situated somewhere with poor ventilation, and if you purchase the 5V 4-pin PWM fan, you can reduce the speed within the Pro's menu to have it running almost silent. The HDMI output can be externally converted to analog as I've shown for the Dexx and RetroTink 5X, or you may opt for the eventual analog output add-on for RGB via a D-Sub-15 VGA connector, so there's no dicking with DACs. Once the add-on's design is finalized, they'll be available to purchase, but until then, the open source files are readily available to download and build yourself like I did, although without an enclosure. In my brief test to see if the add-on board DAC, the ADV7125, outputs appropriate RGB levels, using the Mr. FPGA's SNES core in direct HDMI video mode with a 0 IRE screen, as in all black, the RGB lines output an expected 0 mV. And for the 100 IRE pattern, RGB levels are at an appropriate 700 mV. As for sync, it should run through an inline resistor if using with consumer Scart equipment. A 470 ohm resistor drops sync to 500 mV. Just like the Dexx, the OSSC Pro has two modes to process video: zero lag line multiplier, and scalar mode, which requires frame buffering to allow handling of HD resolutions. The adaptive line multiplier option decimates 480p to instantaneously output 240p or 480i, and that's with zero lag. Not rounded zero, I mean literally zero lag.
Wow.
Therefore, something as trivial as downscaling the House of the Dead 3 on the original Xbox to 240p with light gun and all is entirely a possibility. The line multiplier mode also allows for simple picture repositioning, so for 480p downscaling or even 15 kHz resolution pass-through, basic geometry adjustments can be done on the fly, So for those with an all component or RGB setup, this could mean routing the output of your switcher through the OSSC Pro for mild picture controls. For even more control over the picture size, position, and aspect ratio, there's scaler mode. Input any resolution up to 1080p, go to the scaler menu and choose CRT. Then back out to the output menu and change the processing to scaler. In this mode, both 240p and 480i outputs have a 4:3 and widescreen mode, and they kinda work opposite to what their names suggest. The regular 240p and 480i modes output 16:9 within a 4:3 window, which preserves the aspect ratio. So if the CRT doesn't have a 16:9 mode, the Pro's got you covered. Otherwise, the WS resolutions will stretch the height to fill a 4:3 screen. You can override and alter the aspect ratio for each of the standard 4:3 or WS resolutions, but I'd caution to leave it set to auto, otherwise lag can double when outputting 480i. For the lowest lag, use the regular 480i output, which windows into 16:9, and for 240p, either of the regular or WS widescreen options downscales with just a bit over 1 frame, which is impressive, but not as slick as the RetroTink 5X's ability to downscale 720p within 3 milliseconds. Though I'm certainly not complaining, as I found my tolerance for lag caps out at 2 frames. And unfortunately, around 2 frames of lag when downscaling 1080p to 480i is inevitable no matter how you set the output, which puts it roughly on par with the Corio 2 scalers. It's also best to leave frame lock on, as lag will vary about 22 to 33 milliseconds when it's off. The OSSC Pro won't display certain consoles that flag HDCP through HDMI, so for the PS3, you'll need to run HDMI through a cheap splitter that strips HDCP, and provided you're using a well-endowed power supply, a stripper can be powered via the Pro's front USB input. Otherwise, just output component from the console if you can, and not worry about HDCP altogether. I once described line decimating as similar to wearing shutter glasses, where the information drawn to those alternating lines are discarded for good unless the scaler can shift the image vertically to change which lines in the source video are kept. And thankfully, the OSSC Pro can do this with ease. When downscaling 16:9 to an aspect preserved 240p, 1080 behaves as if it were a perfect integer, where moving the vertical position by 1 pixel makes the test pattern circle disappear and reappear. Whereas 240p WS output with vertical stretching has much coarser scaling prior to decimating. 720 down to 240p in the same WS output has slightly finer line blending prior to line dropping, whereas the aspect preserved 240p output is a perfect 2 out of 3 line deletion for ultra sharp scanlines. And 480 downscale to any of the 240p resolutions produces the same line decimation as scalers like the GBS and RetroTink 5X. An interlaced output follows the same pathway of downscaling as 240p, where the regular 480i output, i.e. 16:9 preserving, yields the sharpest image, versus the 480i WS mode, which appears to duplicate black and white lines to fill out the 4:3 area prior to decimating. Ignoring the test pattern circle altogether and focusing on the side text, both padded 16:9 and stretched 4:3 modes preserve a fair level of vertical detail to make text readable and allow for 3D games to shine. Having seen the benefits and detriments of line decimating downscaling in the Dexx and RetroTink 5X, the same sentiments are echoed in the OSSC Pro. Displaying 3D games in 240p is razor sharp, but gives a stare effect to rounded and geometric shapes. And thankfully, 480i smooths out the detail enough to really enjoy the experience of playing a modern game on a standard definition CRT. But for modern games that pay tribute to the 8 and 16-bit era through pixel art, unless assets were drawn in a 240p resolution, you can expect plenty of vertical shimmer. Compared to a line blending downscaler like the Daido Jr. or Koryo 2 tvOne 750, which has overall better line amalgamation. So instead of being convinced that I'm playing on a console from my childhood, the OSSC Pro pulls the immersive curtain out from my eyes and makes the forbidden fruit taste a bit sour. But Line Decimate, a game that predominantly scrolls horizontally, negates the vertical shimmer, and now I'm having a good time. South Park: The Fractured But Whole should look and play just like the animated series, and I briefly tested the game in 480i using a VSC 500 in the Extron Interface Trick episode. But revisiting the game in 480i on the OSSC Pro, how I miss the combing on the Extron VSC is beyond me. Just like I saw with Pokemon Sword and Shield through the RetroTink 5X's line deletion and Koryo 2's line blending, combing is inevitable when downscaling simplistic 3D games that scroll on a 2D plane. Running the same scene through the line blending Daido Jr. in 240p shows the same level of combing, so it's not at all a fault of the OSSC Pro, but just a reminder that downscaling won't always be sunshine and rainbows. Downscaling 480i to 240p has never been a focus of the series, as I felt there's very little use case for such a scenario. But I have found it particularly useful for downscaling the Panasonic 3DO's Forks 480i video. The 3DO outputs interlace video by default, which can look ultra flickery by interlacing the original 240p progressive fields. Earlier models of the 3DO have a 240p switch, and later consoles can be modified for 240p output. But there's that one problem child that runs at twice the speed when played in 240p.
Wolfenstein.
This game pretty much has to be played in 480i to run the game at normal speed. But if you output 480i RGB or transcoded video from the 3DO to the OSSC Pro and turn on line multiplier downscaling, you can actually play the game in 240p at the regular speed. You'll need an RGB modded 3DO or transcode the output to get it into the OSSC Pro like I am, but when the eventual analog input board becomes available, you can straight up downscale and enjoy this port of Wolfenstein without any console mods. For some later model PSPs, the 480p output of non-PS1 games are windowed to the screen's native resolution of 480 by 272 or 30 by 17, which is 2 vertical pixels over a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. The OSSC Pro Scaler mode makes easy work of stretching the video to fill the entire screen, and presets can be saved to the unit or SD card, and recalling a preset from the remote is a simple touch of a button. And if I want to use the PSP Go to play PS1 games in 240p full screen, then I just set the console to interlace and then set the Pro to line multiplier resolution pass-through, and all of a sudden, I have no need for my Gyro component to RGB transcoder, and I can play PSP games in full screen. Thanks OSSC Pro.
You can always count on me.
One of several features I had on my downscaling wishlist was the ability to downscale 1080p. Not only for convenience so I can leave my HD console set to that resolution, but also because the Evercade VS Atomic Edition defaults to a 1080p output. This console has pretty much become my Duke Nukem DOS widescreen machine, and downscaling to 240p still produces vertical shimmer on the few occasions that Duke climbs a ladder. Otherwise, playing classic Duke in 16:9 with Scanlines looks
bitchin'.
For consoles like the Sega Dreamcast and the original Xbox, which can output 480i and 480p for the bulk of their game libraries, it might make sense to some to run these consoles through the OSSC Pro in 480p and downscale using line multiplier mode. That way, leave it to the Pro to output 480i like the console would've, whilst opening the door to further downscale to 240p for the occasions when you want to get your Scanlines on. And given that the Pro has 3 separate analog inputs, it could also be used as a switcher in pass-through if you're running low on inputs in your setup. By far, my favorite feature of the Dexx was the windowed aspect ratio preserving output, because when paired with my widescreen CRT, produces something magical. This 30-inch Grundig has a 4:3, 16:9 and cinema mode. So if I'm watching a movie, I can view in the normal 4:3 aspect ratio with black pillar bars, or stretch horizontally for 16:9, which gets me in trouble with the aspect ratio police every time. Or I can zoom using the TV's cinema mode, which does the horizontal stretch as well as vertical. So 4:3 content will be the correct aspect, but crops a portion of the top and bottom of the picture. However, with the padded widescreen mode of the OSSC Pro, the ultra windowed video can be restored back to 16:9 with the Grundig Cinema mode, which also draws the scanlines much coarser. So even when I'm sitting at my normal viewing distance, the scanlines in 240p pop with a fidelity reminiscent of a low-grade Pro monitor. And this aesthetic is one that I missed when I switched from a professional video monitor to a consumer CRT, but not anymore. Thanks again, OSSC Pro.
Anytime, pretty boy.
Scoring the Pro out of 10 on the downscaling scorecard, it outputs 240p and 480i and then some. It also accepts the all-important 1080p as well as 720 and the bread and butter 480p. Scoring for lag isn't as straightforward as 1 point if under 2 frames and another point if under 1. It's generally under 2 frames for most scenarios in scalar mode, so at least a point there, but just a tad over 2 when downscaling 1080p and absolutely 0 in 480p line multiplier mode. So overall 1.5 for lag. Just like the Dexx, the output is one of the sharpest you'll get, but be aware that vertical shimmer is something that you'll likely run into. But I felt that it's never been so bad for any of the other downscalers to penalize it for image quality. And finally, those liberal picture controls are insanely good, being able to make pixel adjustments in multiples of 1, 4 and 10 for quick image resizing and shifting. And the ability to save and recall presets means you'll often not need to drastically touch the image window. So in all, the OSSC Pro scores a 9.5 out of 10. Ideally, any scaler used for gaming should be relatively invisible in the video chain, with as little lag as possible. And if you think you'll be affected by the scaler mode sub 1.3 frames, there's always 480p line multiplier mode. But if a practically zero lag 720p input is a necessity, then the RetroTink 5X is still a champion. If the game scrolls vertically, then both are going to produce a shimmery line decimated 240p for non-vertical integer 2 and 3x content. And if the jagged output is offensive to your eyes, then look into softer scalers like a Corio 2 tvOne. But the OSSC Pro has some advantages over those units outside of the downscaling scorecard, like the analog output add-on to make this a completely plug and play downscaler, with no transcoding or sync combining necessary. Its 3 separate analog inputs plus single HDMI means this can be used as a mini console switcher, image shifter, and transcoder, which is a literal game changer. I never expected that a downscaler would help me streamline my RGB auto switching setup, and paired with my widescreen CRT, this is my favorite downscaler so far, and it absolutely gets my recommendation. If Marqs can somehow get the 720p input under a frame and the 1080p under 2, then it scores a perfect 10. Against the RetroTink 5X, they practically cost the same, and if you're okay with just a bit of lag, need a 1080p input, and don't want the hassle of Dexx on the input and output, the OSSC Pro plus analog output board is the clear winner. And don't forget that this is the Downscaling Chronicles, so I've only focused on a fractional portion of what the Pro can do. In the meanwhile, I'm waiting patiently for Pixel FX to bake 15kHz downscaling into the more 4K that doesn't require a user custom mode line, as well as their analog crosspoint. So I'm eager to see if their scaler can deliver an even better downscaling experience than the OSSC Pro.
Godlike.
Thanks all for watching, and happy gaming.
You are the winner.